Gonna go ahead and get started. I am Ellie Casa with the Potomac River Jazz Club, and we are, if you're not familiar, an organization in the DC area that has promoted traditional jazz for now 50 years. We're celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. And we off and on have done various educational things in the past, but when the pandemic started, we started these monthly educational Zoom lectures and have hosted a myriad of musicians and historians, both from the New Orleans area and East Coast DC area and up into New York. And we're really excited tonight to have Kris Tokarski with us. We have got somebody with mic on. Just gonna quiet that for a minute. Sorry. So we open this up to everybody and we make it a free lecture, but I will send a link around. You got one with your confirmation with this, but I will send a follow-up link that we do take donations toward the presentation to offset the costs because we do pay the speakers, and it's a way to help musicians have a little more income as they're trying to reclaim their ability to do some live gigs and such. So please do look out for that, and if you're able, please do chip in toward the presentation if you can. So Kris, I've seen do some online concerts, the piano on a truck, which is fantastic stuff in New Orleans. Somebody has bolted a piano in the back of a pickup truck, and people can do concerts on it in the streets. And you know, all the different ways people have tried to work around being able to present music during this time. It's just been phenomenal. And so I've been aware of Kris from other things, but I thought, hey, he'd be kind of a cool person to get to do a presentation. He is from the East Coast, from the New Jersey area, if I read correctly, but he moved to New Orleans to do his master's degree about 10 years ago, and there he is, still in New Orleans, loving the music and embracing the culture. So without further ado, Kris is going to start his presentation on the music and professors of Storyville.
Thank you.
Yay!
All right, live studio audience. All right, thank you. And I'm going to be talking about a little bit about the history of Storyville to start out with, but we'll be mostly focusing on the music that came out of there. So probably, I mean, you're all jazz fans, so you've probably all heard of Storyville. Storyville was, of course, the infamous red light district of New Orleans, and it operated from, I think, 1897 and was shut down permanently in 1917. And it was located just above the French Quarter. I'm sure many of you have been to New Orleans. Basin Street was kind of the southern border of the district, and it was bounded by Basin Street, North Robertson Street, Iberville, and St. Louis Street, right where the cemeteries are. So kind of creepy, but and actually that you may remember there that there's a building called Basin Street Station. It's not the original, but there was a train station. That was the train station that, if you were a visitor to New Orleans, it pulled right into Basin Street Station. So your first thing you would see coming out as a visitor to New Orleans was you were entering the district, as they called it. And they would even pass out these little blue books. It was called the Blue Book, advertising the various sporting houses and saloons. And of course the women had their own ads in it. So this was like your first thing that you would see coming into New Orleans. And you may be wondering why Storyville? Why is it called Storyville? Before Storyville was established, there wasn't really any specific red light district, kind of limitations on where you can have the sporting houses. They were in the French Quarter. They were, on the other side of Canal Street and all that. But there was a piece of legislation proposed by Alderman Sidney Story, and much to his displeasure, it was nicknamed Storyville after him. And what could you find in Storyville? If we're all adults, we know what the red light district is, so I don't have to get into that. But there was, cabaret life. There were saloons, and then the sporting houses of various, various degrees of how high class it is, let's say. So right on Basin Street, you had the big mansions, these really beautiful buildings at the time, very ornate. And as you went further back towards Robertson Street, then you had what you called the cribs and all that. And another thing to mention that's important is, I don't know if it was right from the start, but certainly at some point, there were essentially two Storyvilles. There was the one I mentioned, bounded by those streets, and then there was another, there was the Black Storyville on the other side of Canal Street, where modern day City Hall stands, which, it's New Orleans, why not? So unfortunately, those buildings on Basin Street were torn down in the 1930s, and there was project housing put in them. But if you visit New Orleans again, there's still actually a couple buildings that still stand there. One of them is on Basin Street. It's just a little unassuming brick building, one story. It used to be two. The top of it was blown off in a hurricane. And it used to be Lulu White's Saloon. And right across the street on Basin Street was her sporting house. So her saloon was next door, and the sporting house was next to that. I think it's now a seafood / convenience market. The second one that's also interesting that you might go and drive past during the day, not at night, is one on Villeray Street. And it's also a convenience store now, but it was Frank Early's Saloon. That was what it was called, Frank Early's Saloon. And that is where Tony Jackson played. He had a regular gig there, as well as in one of the sporting houses. But he lived on the second story of that building. And you might be familiar with the tune Pretty Baby. The rumor is that he wrote Pretty Baby up there when he was living there at the time. And there's one more building, but there's really no cool stories about it. I can't find anything out about it. Probably was a bar or something at the time, but at least in terms of the music, no real significance to it. And it closed in 1917. The whole district closed as the United States entered the First World War. And the federal government did not want any brothels within 5 miles of a military base. And we had a Navy base nearby, so they didn't want the sailors getting in any trouble or bringing any venereal disease and spreading it. So they proposed this legislation. There was a crackdown. In fact, there was a couple weeks of violence where 4 soldiers got killed, I think in a bar fight. And so that's really when the government kind of cracked down on it. And it officially ended midnight, November 12th, 1917. And the mayor of New Orleans at the time was Martin Berman, and he's quoted as saying, "You can make it illegal, but you can't make it unpopular." So even though it closed, those prohibited activities just went underground. And through the 1920s, a lot of the establishments still existed as cabarets and bars and nightlife, but officially the former activities were prohibited, at least on the books. All right, and so now we come to why we're here. Why is this all relevant to to jazz, traditional jazz. And it is most important to piano players. Most of the band activity, in terms of ensemble playing, where bands played, that was mostly happening kind of where Louis Armstrong grew up, on kind of South Liberty and Perdido streets on the other side of Canal Street. And there are still some buildings there today where bands were playing. And also a neighborhood that you would never really think of up in Lakeview, which is right on Lake Pontchartrain, and there was a beach there and resort, and bands would play at picnics up there. And that was a really popular place for bands to play. So that's where the you kind of have a distinction between the ensembles of New Orleans and the piano players, because we have a rich history in both settings. Solo piano, we have a rich history, and brass bands and society bands and, you know, traditional jazz bands or Dixieland bands, whatever you want to call it, you could find in these other places. King Oliver's band did play occasionally in Storyville, out on the sidewalk of one of the sporting houses to attract people in, but there's not really this big history of bands playing there. But it was a place of lucrative employment for piano players, and there was a lot of these piano professors, they called them, that played in the sporting houses. And of course the most famous of them was Jelly Roll Morton. He's also the most famous because he's the only one, or certainly, well, there's a couple that were recorded, but he was really the one who became a big recording artist. Unfortunately, people like Tony Jackson, who was one of the greatest, unfortunately never recorded. He died in 1921. Maybe had he lived longer, he might have been recorded. But Jelly is the one who recorded, became a big name, and he made all these recordings for the Library of Congress close to the end of his life, 1938. And we have a lot of information about Storyville and all the other piano professors that worked in Storyville. And that's where I got a lot of my information, and I also got a lot of information at the New Orleans Historic Collection, where they have hours and hours and hours of recorded interviews with some of these other piano professors that maybe were known locally, or even many of them forgotten, but kind of lived long enough, and once there was the kind of this revival of traditional jazz, interest in traditional jazz in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, people like Bill Russell interviewed these guys. And we have these recordings and interviews at the Historic Collection. It would be cool if they were released on some sort of commercial disc collection, but you have to go in there and ask for it and listen carefully. But that's where I got most of my information from, about anecdotes and what repertoire was played there and descriptions of all that. So the three main piano players I'll talk about are Jelly Roll, will be our number one guy, and then Tony Jackson and Manuel Manetta. Monetta recorded a lot of these interviews, so I'll reference him at different points. But let's talk about Tony Jackson first. Tony Jackson was, out of those mentioned, the oldest of them. He was a senior to Jelly Roll, and as braggadocious as Jelly was, he always considered Tony Jackson to be his superior. He said he was the single greatest pianist and entertainer in New Orleans, and he probably thought he was the best in the country, which is saying a lot. He really must have been great. And not only was he a piano player, he was a great singer. He could sing anything from real low-down blues to these operatic pieces, because New Orleans, of course, has a history of opera here too. There was the French Opera House right in the French Quarter. So he could really play any type of tune, and he was meant to have this really gifted memory. You know, there wasn't anything he couldn't play that he didn't. If he heard it, he could play it. He's one of those guys. I'm a little jealous. And Tony Jackson, he, you know, by Jelly's account, he must have had a difficult life. He was a black, gay, ragtime pianist who suffered from epilepsy. And but this really talented guy who really was beloved by the musicians and the people he worked with in town. And he eventually moved to Chicago in the teens and played up there. Jelly says he wasn't making as much money, but he preferred I guess the atmosphere and the lifestyle up there a little bit better. And of course, lots of musicians went up to Chicago, especially after the closing of Storyville, because work started to dry up in New Orleans. Let me play. We don't have any recordings of Tony, but we do have Morton's impressions of his playing. And we'll get into the different styles of music that were played in Storyville in a little while. But this is one type of tune that he says Tony Jackson was well known for. And they were called naked dances. And this was meant to accompany the girls when they were doing the dance. And well, let's let Jelly Roll explain. Let me just make sure I get to the right starting point on this.
Well,
let's see. We'll go from here.
Used any dope. For your information, I will try to play one of the Tony Jackson's fast speed tunes like he used to play years ago. Tony used to play these things in the sporting houses for what they call the naked dances. Of course, they were naked dances, all right, because they absolutely was stripped.
And there you have it. Well, I've got these up. You know, I mentioned that Morton did these recordings for the Library of Congress, and he did these impressions of several of these piano players. And he did a couple more for these guys that weren't recorded. And I'm going to play one more of these where he talks about Sammy Davis, who was a New Orleans pianist around the turn of the century, peer of Jelly's, who I think, I might be wrong about this, I think he ended up at the end of his life in New York. I think in Albany, New York. And I wish I could, supposedly there are some recordings out there of an interview and maybe a little bit of playing. They might have been lost. I've only read some accounts of this, but I don't know anybody who knows where these are. But actually in the interview, there's mention that Sammy Davis was on a recording session with King Oliver, and my memory's blanking now, but there's one session with a singer he describes as a sweet singer, meaning that the quality of his voice was a sweet tone. And there's two sides that it sounds an awful lot like only he's not credited on the record company's personnel. Somebody else is credited on it, which, you know, it might not be the one, but it wouldn't be the first time that these record companies had an error in their personnel listing. So there actually might be this commercial recording of Sammy Davis. There wasn't any solo on it, really. But anyway, just an interesting tidbit. But this is Jelly's impression of Sammy Davis.
For a little illustration of Sammy Davis, I will see if I can imitate him just a bit. Well, I don't know the name of this tune. I only remembered a little bit. Of course, it's been years since I've seen Sammy. Yeah, that's considered ragtime. That was one of his styles. Most everybody had a different style. And among them we had, no doubt, right, according to what I can understand.
All right, and he goes on to talk about Tony Jackson. But an important point there that he makes at the end is that everybody had a different style. Of course, there weren't recording jazz records at that time. So as you had the proliferation of jazz records, you have more of this, you could put on the record and copy exactly off of it, but at that time it was all live, and you learned from each other in person, and you ended up with maybe more of these personalized styles. And he goes through and talks about all of these different characters that were playing in Storyville at the time and their very personal styles. Now, to me, that sounds a lot like Jelly, so I wonder how much he was influenced by him, or how much of it is he's trying to recall this 30 years later. Probably the latter. But and another interesting thing he says at the end there is that's considered ragtime. We end up putting labels on things after the fact, right? We think of ragtime as Scott Joplin, Maple Leaf Rag, The Entertainer, that sort of thing. And, Scott Joplin didn't want any improvisation in his rags, but that's not what these guys were doing. This was just the local hip way of playing ragtime. There was no word jazz yet. So another thing to keep in mind is this was ragtime to them. All right. Okay. Then I had mentioned Manuel Manetta. Monetta was the same age as Jelly, maybe a year older, actually. And Monetta did record commercially once with the Papa Celestine's band in 1925. No solo on the record. You could hear him in the background. But then there were these extensive interviews in the 50s, I think. And he's already an older man at this point. And you wonder how he sounded as a young man. We can't really tell, but he was certainly well respected as a piano player at the time, and he was well respected later as a music educator. He was a teacher. He lived in Algiers Point, and he taught wind instruments and he taught the piano. And I think Butch Thompson met him, and he has an anecdote about this trick that Mineta used to do where he played the trombone and the cornet at the same time. I don't know how it's possible, but Butch Thompson saw it with his own eyes, so I believe him. But let me bring up a recording of, I X'd out of it. Let's see, Manuel Manetta playing. Unfortunately, he's not sounding so good in his old age, but it would be worth hearing. And it's also significant to point out that he's playing in this Spanish tinge style that Jelly says was so important to jazz. So this is a recording called Anita.
You like beer?
Well, there's an ad, sorry. Let me turn that off. Great, a beer ad. Okay, here it comes. That out, you get the idea. That's probably the best one out of that little collection of recordings. So when Monetta was working in the district, his main gig was, I think it was at Lulu White's. He talks about Lulu White in his interviews. He says that her favorite song was the Maple Leaf Rag, which was very popular at the time, and I got a lot of info on what the pop tunes were that were being played at the time. Things like Home Sweet Home, you know, popular tune at the turn of the century. One that I'll play later, a sentimental tune called Sweetie Dear by Joe Jordan. That was a popular one to play. And, you know, just lots of interesting little stories. One that I thought was particularly funny was he had his gig at Lulu White's Saloon, and that would have been a lucrative gig. And he unfortunately lost the gig because he must have had some other engagement to play, and so he subbed it out. I don't know if anybody else here is a musician, but musicians are always subbing out their gig to go play another gig for more money, and then the sub doesn't show up, and then you get fired from your regular gig. So this has been happening for 125 years, and that's what happened to Manuel Manetta's his work in Storyville. That's kind of how that came to a close. But he was a teacher as well, and he was I guess a mentor to Jelly Roll. You know, they were about the same age, like I said, but at that time, Mineta was probably a little bit more of a schooled musician than young Morton was. And I think he said Jelly only played in the key of B flat at the time, and he instilled in him the importance of learning to play in different keys. And Morton was certainly very talented, as we know, and took to that very quickly. And he even showed him a chord progression that is what eventually became the chord progression to Whinin' Boy Blues. If you know Jelly's music, we all know Whinin' Boy Blues. And that was Mineta who showed him that chord progression, and Jelly came up with the melody and the lyrics, and of course the name, because that was named after him. Jelly, before he was Jelly Roll, he was the Whinin' Boy, right? he got the nickname Jelly Roll later on, probably after being in New Orleans already. So that's Manuel Manetta. And I've already talked about Jelly Roll a good bit, but and you're already familiar with him. But just a couple things I want to stress about him is, despite his claims to have invented jazz and this sort of braggadocious character that he was, I think the reality is kind of tempered by the talk. He could back a lot of that up. Of course, no one person invents jazz, but he was right there at the beginning. He was the first to put it down on paper and publish it in 1915 with the original Jelly Roll Blues. He was really the first great arranger and composer, and judging by these Library of Congress recordings, he thought a lot about the music, and you can say he's the first real, I guess, intellectual of the music. He had definite opinions on what makes jazz jazz, whether his talk about playing breaks or the Latin tinge or tempo and dynamics. All this, he thought a lot about it and put it into his music, and he was the first to do a lot of these things. So his claim about inventing jazz is not so wild as we make it out to be. And those that worked with him really liked him. They said he was a good band leader. He had, he knew what he wanted, and he gave you what he wanted, and then let you go off and do what you will with it. He gave you some parameters, and then he trusted his guys to play the way they play. So really, he wasn't. We kind of make a caricature of him sometimes, but it's tempered by the truth, I think. Maybe I'll take a little pause here, and if anybody has any questions, that was a lot of talking there, so maybe you guys have thought of something you want to ask, and maybe I'll know an answer.
I'll just pop in a little note about the Historic New Orleans collection. I was there a few weeks ago. They have a wonderful exhibit right now on the history of brass bands in New Orleans. Doesn't go back, of course, quite as far as, the area you're talking about in Storyville, but a lot of these musicians had roots in Storyville. And the person who took us around was talking about the collection and the recordings and such that you mentioned of all these guys. And it is just open to the public. I think they do during the pandemic require an appointment, but you can go in and request any of their recordings. There are a few things, some things are available online, I think, but any of you, if you're in New Orleans or if you travel there and have an interest in this, I highly recommend popping over to the museum because they have a very, very vast collection and are really happy to share it with people.
Yeah, it's a great place. It's such a great resource here.
I don't have questions, but I just wanted to say how interesting I'm finding all of this.
Am I the only one that's getting that broken up, or?
No.
Oh, you're muted.
I was kind of fascinated by the part you did on Spanish style rag. I didn't know that existed. It reminded me very much of what went on in the 40s with all this wonderful romantic Spanish. So it was going on all that time, huh? From the 1915s and 1900s.
Yeah, it was. I'll
Wow.
I'm gonna do some demonstrations. The second part of this, I'm gonna do some demonstrations, and we'll talk a little bit more about that for sure.
I appreciate you putting that in there. That was really a new insight to me.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Hey, Kris, Rachel Erickson here. I had a question. I had to step away 1 second. When I came back, you said about jazz started to get born. The guy who paid attention to dynamics
and breaks. But that was not Jelly Roll Morton. Was that his mentor? Who was that when you were referring to that?
I was referring to Jelly.
Oh, that is Jelly Roll Morton. Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, that's all in the Library of Congress recordings. He demonstrates what a break is, and
yeah,
there's a one track on there called Sweet Jazz Music, and he's making the point that this music is meant to be, played sweetly. It doesn't have to be too fast. It doesn't have to be too loud.
Right.
Just kind of your half glass, glass is half full concept. Yeah. You could fill it up more, or you can spill some out and have a wider range of dynamics.
Very good. Thank you.
Yep.
The first piece you played was almost at stride piano to me. It was very fast. Were they playing stride back then, or is that something came later in the 40s maybe?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say stride has a specific definition and a general definition. We'll say stride with a capital S is the style of jazz piano that came out of Harlem,
right,
in the late teens and 20s. And the real father of stride piano is James P. Johnson, and that whole school gave way to Fats Waller and Willie the Lion Smith and Donald Lambert. That's a specific style that also comes out of ragtime. There was all of the, I had this conversation yesterday, a lot of the elements that created jazz music, blues, ragtime, music from the church, marching music, and European classical music. All these things, they didn't only exist in New Orleans. If we're going to point to one city where you could say the birth of jazz took place, you would say New Orleans would be that place, but you could also make the argument that, well, it kind of did creep up in other places independently of New Orleans in some ways, and you have a lot of early guys make that claim, like Willie the Lion, saying we were playing blues, we were playing jazz in the teens, before the big migration of New Orleans musicians occurred. So that stride style from Harlem, same thing. They had East Coast ragtime, U.B. Blake, Lucky Roberts. Those were James P.'s mentors, and he just did what that was his hip way of playing ragtime in New York. And the piece that you heard earlier was Tony Jackson's hip way of playing ragtime in New Orleans. So, and then stride with the lowercase s is, it comes out of ragtime, playing this oompa style with the left hand. That's why it's called stride. Your left hand is striding back and forth. So that's generally what stride means, but there was this other kind of more specific style that came out of Harlem that was given like the label stride piano. All right. Maybe I'll move on to some of these demonstrations. All right. Yeah, so I wanted to talk about the various styles of music that would have been played in Storyville. And there was a lot of music going on in New Orleans. As I mentioned earlier, there was the bands playing their own, there's marching bands and brass band music, society orchestras, and then the piano players as well. Obviously, lots of overlap and crossover, but all these things were represented by the piano players in Storyville. So let's see. Maybe I'll give an example of that a pop tune that was popular then. I had mentioned Sweetie Dear earlier. I'll try and recall that one. That was written by Joe Jordan. He was a ragtime pianist, not from New Orleans. I think. Well, I'm not really sure. Maybe the Midwest. But he wrote ragtime, and I think he wrote for shows as well. And this is kind of like a good example of a sentimental tune. Let me get a better view here. Thank you. Just a sweet, sentimental pop tune from the 19 teens. That was a popular one. That's one I got from those Monetta recordings. He mentions that one in it. Of course, blues would have been an important piece of this puzzle. Maybe I'll play two examples of some blues here. You had this kind of real low-down barrel house style that Morton demonstrates. I'll do a few choruses of that, and then you also had this real. Well, I'll get to it before I play it. Let's just do this barrel house thing first. So you can hear that, that sounds a lot like really early boogie woogie, this left hand thing going on. That kind of playing was present all over you know, especially all over the South at the time. So that's the sort of thing Morton played on some of those records to give an idea of what was played in the, you know, kind of saloons, these late night saloons. He also plays some blues that has definitely a distinctive New Orleans flavor to it. And let me play a little bit of that. It's kind of interesting because this particular blues, to me, is like the prototype for all of New Orleans piano music after that. He recorded it a few times, first called New Orleans Joys. He recorded that in 1923. And it's essentially more of a collection of blues strains that were probably floating around his environment at the time. He doesn't, you know, his name is on it, but he doesn't claim complete credit for it because he said, I had the help of a mentor of his, Frank Richards, I think he says the guy's name was, help him put this together. So think of it as 4 separate blues strains that we connect. And it has this Latin, this Spanish tinge element to it. And you might hear in the second strain a riff that sounds an awful lot like a riff you hear in a lot of early New Orleans R&B or rock and roll. New Orleans Joys. You could also find it recorded under the title New Orleans Blues. Yeah, that's just that's the beginning of what became New Orleans jazz piano, right there. That piece. Now, this is a good way to get into the Spanish tinge that we were talking about earlier. You can hear in the left hand this rhythm. Right? So they're playing that in blues music too, that kind of Spanish tinge. And if you're familiar with Afro-Cuban music, you've heard of a clave. It's the first half of that clave. You take away those 2 quarter notes in the second bar of it, and you're left with the, right? And that's called a habanera rhythm. That's what they called it. So there was even a section of Rampart Street, I think, which ran just adjacent to Basin Street. So right alongside Storyville, there was a section of town called the Tango Belt, and there was a lot of establishments where you can hear this kind of music there. And of course, New Orleans also has a connection to the Caribbean. Sometimes it's called the northernmost city of the Caribbean. So definitely all this influence from Cuba and the rest of the Caribbean. So that's where that comes from. This one is probably Jelly's most well-known of these kind of pieces. It's called The Crave, and there's a movie called The Legend of 1900. Kind of an interesting film, but this piece is featured in the movie. right, that's the Crave, and that's a really great example of that Spanish tinge that Morton stressed was so important. And a couple other pieces of this puzzle here. They talk a lot about the kind of light opera and light classical music that you would have found in the district, and also a lot of the maybe popular songs from other, from other countries. We had visitors from all over, even during those times. And one song form that would have been represented were mazurkas, waltzes and mazurkas. And Manuel Manetta talks about a mazurka called Moonwinks. It's written by George Stevens. And for those of you who don't know what a mazurka is, originally it's a Polish dance. And this became, it became sort of a style popularized by Chopin, the Polish composer. And it's similar to a waltz in that it's 3/4 time, but the accent of it is different. When you have a waltz, you have accent on beat 1. 1. The accent is on beat 2, and you often have this little skip beat in it with a mazurka. So that's what a mazurka is, and this would have been kind of nice, light, dance music at the time. So let's play, I won't take the repeats on all this, but just an example of this light mazurka music that you would have had. Moonwinks. All right, and that's one that Manuel Manetta cites as something that you would have heard in those days there. All right, a couple more things here. Of course, there's ragtime. We haven't come to that yet. Why don't I go ahead and play Lulu White's favorite, the Maple Leaf Rag, played in kind of this New Orleans style. Now, I would definitely recommend going and checking out the Library of Congress recordings of Morton playing the Maple Leaf Rag. It's astounding. But I will do my best to give you an idea of that style of ragtime. Thank you very much. That's Maple Leaf Rag, of course, by Scott Joplin. And now why don't I'm going to play one more, and then I'll open it up to a few questions. And I should conclude with something by Jelly Roll Morton. And he says he wrote this in 1906, so pretty early on, which means that he very well could have been playing it in Storyville in those days. At that point, he was already traveling quite a bit, and he met a musician in Pensacola, Florida, who he said was a very well-educated musician who he respected, called Porter King. And he wrote this piece after him, but he switched the name, and it became the King Porter Stomp. Right? And about 30 years later, Benny Goodman had a hit with it. So this is probably probably his most well-known composition, King Porter Stomp. Thank you. And that's the King Porter Stomp by Jelly Roll Morton. And looks like we got a little bit of time here. If anybody has any questions, that sound like a plan?
Yeah, I do.
Go ahead, Maynard.
Okay, so I wonder, have you ever visited the Scott Joplin house in St. Louis?
No questions?
We have somebody asking one.
I can't hear you.
So I asked about the Scott Joplin house in St. Louis. Have you ever?
Oh, there we go. I think it was my, I can hear you now.
You can hear it?
I can hear it, yep.
Okay, I was asking about the Scott Joplin house in St. Louis. Have you had occasion to visit there, and do you know if there's? It's on the historic register, but I don't know if there's any museum pieces there.
I was in St. Louis about a year and a half ago, and I met the fellow who was basically, I guess, the curator of it, Brian Cather. And unfortunately, well, two unfortunate things. One, when I was there, he was getting some dental work done and couldn't show me the museum. I think it was by appointment. So unfortunately, I missed out on that. And then the more unfortunate thing is that Brian unexpectedly passed away about a year ago.
Oh.
So I don't know what is going on with the Scott Joplin house right now. That could be a good question for T.J. Muller, who some of you might know is kind of the.
Well, I never
seen up there.
I had never heard of it when I was talking to Jeff Barnhart in St. Louis, and he was telling me about it, but it was at an early stage, and I didn't know if it had been. Scott Joplin was there only for about 3 or 4 years, I think, in St. Louis, but that's where he composed The Entertainer, and that's probably the most famous piece after the Robert Redford film.
Oh, right. Sting. Yeah, I wish I got to see it, but yeah, I don't really know what's going on over there now.
Okay, so that's all right. Go on to the next question.
All right.
Any other questions? Don't be shy.
Can I just say how much I enjoyed the talk? This was really a lot of fun. Thank you.
I appreciate that. Glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah, real nice playing, Kris. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
I have a question about, was there any dancing going on in Storyville when these guys were playing the piano? Do you know?
I'm sure there was. Dancing was popular in New Orleans in general, very popular. So, there would have been dancing for sure, and certainly in the cabarets and the saloons there.
There were 3 of them.
Any of the venues outside of the sporting houses, I'm sure there was, social dancing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
I was just thinking to the piano music, because there was 3 of those pieces she played, the blues number and 2 of the rags, that the kind of dancing that I'm turned on to was, I just could see swing dancing to them, even as fast as the rags were, and definitely the blues piece. And I thought, I don't see how those people could sit down in those, even in the, in the Storyville places, and not want to get up and dance. And your piano seems like it's got such a full sound, it really makes good music.
Thank you. Yeah, there would have been dancing for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
It may have been said in the introduction, but I'm kind of curious about what you do for a living? Kind of, how do you divide up your time as a musician? Are you a performer or a teacher, or I don't know what the other options are, but
right, yeah. Yeah, pre-pandemic was pretty much just performing.
okay.
Locally, there fortunately is a lot of work, so you know, I'm playing most nights of the week in town, and then also festivals all over the place. You know, maybe once a month out of town, and then pandemic times I took up teaching. I had done some teaching before, but took up teaching, and right now things are opening back up here, and I have a nice comfy balance between the two that I think I'd like to probably keep it that way.
Yeah. So are you playing in a bunch of just those popular clubs that they have the bands in, or is there another set of venues that you know, really attract you, or that you're attracted to, where people don't get quite so drunk and can really listen?
Well, lots of places have music here. I wish there was a couple more proper jazz clubs that were more listening room.
Right.
But you know, before all this, there was also places where you could play and dance, like we've been talking about, which is a lot of fun to do, to play for dancers and kind of serve the original purpose of the music. So right now it's more, you know, solo piano, duo, trio things rather than full bands. I don't know how many places want to hire a 6-piece band right now. I mean, that was hard before the pandemic to do that. So.
Do you play with some trios, or do you play always solo?
I play all of the above.
Great.
Yep.
I'm gonna look you up. I'm down there in October, so I'm gonna be looking you up.
Yeah. Come find me.
Hey, Kris.
Great. It was great. Brought back my soul. I don't want to occupy the thing. I did a lot of dancing to Papa Celestin. He was still around when I was in high school.
Oh, yeah.
And I played in homes, you know, people's homes.
Oh,
so
wow.
Very intimate kind of an arrangement with him.
That's cool that you get to see him. Yeah.
A question for you, Kris. It's Rachel again. Without showing too much of your hand, I mean, do you play from transcriptions, or do you transcribe some of those yourself, what you played just now? Can you just comment on that?
Sure. I don't play transcriptions, but I learn the style from doing my own transcribing, or if there's already a transcription that's already been written out that you could find. There's a great book that James DePogny put out on.
Right, I have that one.
Yeah,
I know which one you mean.
It's a great resource. You know, I kind of use it as almost like a reference book. You know, if there's something specific about Jelly's playing that I want to see exactly what he's doing, I might go to it to find what are these sixths that he's playing in his left hand, but not to learn the whole transcription. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay.
Sure thing.
Any other questions before we wrap up for the evening? Last chance.
I just have a note. We were dancing during your performance, just so you know.
Good. Well, that answers that question.
Great gal. You get an A+.
Excellent.
Very good.
Thank you for listening, and thanks for showing up.
And thank you so much for coming and doing this or doing it from where you are. We really enjoyed the presentation. And again, folks, you got a link today that gave you the link to get into the Zoom. If you want to, if you use PayPal and you'd like to donate a little something toward the performance, please do. Not required, but most certainly appreciated, so we can keep putting these on and keep putting these on. And And we will post the video of this. I will post the video of this most likely tomorrow on YouTube and send the link out. So if you want to go back and re-listen to something, we'll have it up there for you. And then also keep your eyes out, because we have some other great performance or talks, jazz talks coming up. In June, we're going to have Seth Keibel doing a talk for us about clarinetist Buster Bailey, who is a not very well-known clarinetist. And if y'all know Seth, he's quite a character. So that's apt to be a really fun presentation. So anyway, we'll put more information out about that. And big round of applause for Kris.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Did you have another question, Jerry?
Just one thing. Do you know what the site looks like on the donate? While we were doing this, I looked to donate, and I think I wound up asking you to send me some money from what it said.
Yeah, you got to be careful with that. I almost did that too.
I'm sure you're not going to do it, but what button do you push? I couldn't figure it out, and I didn't want to get too distracted. So I would like to send you some money. This was well worth it.
I think you can put the dollar amount in, and there's you click send. There's an ask and a send, I believe.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Maybe, yeah. There were two words like that. I'll find the right two. And, if you send me the money, I'll double it and send you some back. Okay?
I don't have a PayPal account. I don't use PayPal. Do you have an address or some other way?
We do. When I will send a summary out with that YouTube link, and I will also send an address where if you'd rather send a paper check, we're happy to do that. So
that's great. And what's the date of the Seth Kibble talk? What is the date of the Seth Kibble talk in June?
Seth's talk it's a Wednesday. I believe it's the 16th.
Okay.
June 16th. Yes.
Yeah.
And it'll be the same time, 7 o'clock.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, everybody. Thank you so much. Enjoy your evening. And thanks again to Kris. And we will see everybody again soon.
All right.
Thank you.
Chris,
You're welcome.